Prophets of Assyria. This is the fourth and final part in the series where we've been looking at the prophets who spoke in the context of Assyria, Jonah and Nahum. And in this part we're going to look at the remainder of the prophecies that Nahum gave. Prophets of Assyria. In the land of Judah, the people of God, storm clouds were gathering all over them. The threat of the Assyrian Empire was growing stronger, likely to overrun them and destroy them with their cruel brutality. Hezekiah had introduced some spiritual reforms, but tragically his son Manasseh had reversed these reforms, and over his long reign the land had drifted back into spiritual weakness. So the land and the people of God was threatened and spiritually powerless. And into this, Nahum brings a message of hope for the threatened people of God. When God is at work, there are three key principles. God is patient. He has infinite power, and He will put things right, and He will do it correctly. We often want to rush things, but God gives them maximum time and opportunity for people groups to put their house in order. But He has infinite power, and He knows what is right, and He knows what is best for you and me, and is quite able to carry it through to completion. We human beings, we think we can live ignoring God, thumbing our nose at Him in a spirit of rebellion. However, the consequences for our living are inevitable as night follows day, and things will happen and empires will fall when empires continue to thumb their nose at God, and history is littered with examples of just this. Now let's move on into chapter 1 and starting at verse 3. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of His feet. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. The mountains quake before Him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at His presence, the world and all who live in it. Who can withstand His indignation? Who can endure His fierce anger? His wrath is poured out like fire. His rocks are shattered before Him. God comes to put things right. And that's how we understand God's anger. He's angry when anything or anyone messes up human lives. And He comes to put things right, and Nahum has pictured this in vivid poetry. God is in control of this world. He made it. But He also made us. And we rebel and hurt others. Sooner or later, there will be consequences as night follows day. God is indignant at what we human beings do to each other. He is angry when people suffer. And He comes to put things right. It's not emotional anger, it's righteous anger. And He comes to put things right. And this is what was going to happen with regard to the empire of Assyria. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in Him, but with an overwhelming flood He will make an end of Nineveh. He will pursue its foes into the realm of darkness. Whatever they plot against the Lord, He will bring to an end. Trouble will not come a second time. They'll be entangled among thorns and drunk from their wine. They'll be consumed like dry stubble. From you, Nineveh, has one come forth who plots evil against the Lord and devises wicked plans. Probably referring to Ashurbanipal, the last great warrior emperor, king of the Assyrians, who brought cruelty to a new level of brutality. When we trust in God, He does provide a refuge. No matter what life circumstances may throw us, there is a peace and inner security when we trust in Him. But people who plot against God, thumbing their nose at Him in rebellion and perpetrating all kinds of evil and brutality in those around, there are consequences for their action. There's the description. This empire plotted evil against the ways of God, and it devised wicked plans. It accumulated wealth that stripped nations. It killed people. It tortured people. Its brutality was legendary. It was horrendous. And ordinary people suffered. Other rulers were shaking in their boots at the thought that the Assyrians were coming, knowing what was going to happen. It's been described that way. Just stop and ponder for a moment. Throughout the world, there are leaders, including the West, where there's a deliberate resistance to what God is saying and doing. God is in the business of the best for mankind. His agenda is the best for all the nations of the world. And there are people in leadership at all kinds of levels who are resisting that way of God. And ordinary folk like you and me, we suffer. But you can bring it down to a personal level, not at a leadership level. Just as that does affect us today. Is there a deliberate resistance to what God is saying and doing, even amongst God's people? It's a question worth pondering. This is what the Lord says. Although they, that's the Assyrians, have allies and are numerous, they will be destroyed and pass away. Although I have afflicted you, Judah, people of God, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to hear your name. I will destroy the idols, the images and idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile. What a picture. They had enormous strength in numbers. We've seen that their ability to wage war was way ahead of all the other people groups in the area. But Nahum sees that this entire evil culture will fall. Not only fall, but will disappear. And history shows that a few decades later, it did fall, and it did disappear completely. And the religious systems just vanished. But the people of God, Judah, who are being threatened the whole time, the storm clouds around them, having to pay money to keep the Assyrians off their back, and they just came back for more, threatening them all the time. The people of God will be set free from the shackles of the Assyrians. In the Hebrew, the grammar tells us that this is referring to a person, not a city. Ashurbanipal, he had named a son, and he published that anyone resisting this decision would be subject to judgment from the Assyrian gods. Nahum is saying here, you won't have descendants ruling Assyria. And he didn't. He brought cruelty and evil to a peak. He was powerful, ambitious, destructive, brutal. But he brought this empire to an end, because it comes to an end if we persist in rebellion against God. It implodes, it collapses, it falls apart. History shows that the empire was stretched far too far. And when he died, the signs of its corrosion and corruption were already there. And a decade or two later, the whole thing collapsed. Into chapter 2. Nahum describes the collapse of Nineveh. Remarkable accuracy. Nineveh, the capital of this Assyrian Empire. He pictures an army approaching the city. The defences made ready. But the defences fail. This much vaunted defence system they had, it failed. The wall was breached. It is pillaged, plundered, stripped. And it was. The fall of the city was total. Nothing was left. It was totally flattened. Flattened so much that people forgot it even existed. And all the wealth that had accumulated was stripped out. That's how Nahum describes it. Situated on the rivers, with all the protection of the rivers and the water, is like a pool, says Nahum, and its water is draining away. It was finished. Gone. But at the same time, the Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob like the splendor of Israel. Though destroyers, that's the Assyrians, have laid them waste and have ruined their vines and agricultural people that come and strip the land. There'll be a time of restoration. There was a chance for Judah to put its house in order, but it didn't. There's a general happiness at the fall of Nineveh. This is the great arch-enemy off their backs for a while. Forever. They're free. They're no longer under shackles. They no longer have to watch for the armies of the enemies coming and laying waste their land. You see, they reveled in cruelty. Here is a picture of one of the Assyrian rulers. He proudly displayed this. I think in the original it says I covered, but I've put it into the third person. He covered a pillar with the skins of the leader whom he had flayed alive. He skinned them alive. Imagine the torture. Then he sealed some people to have a slow death inside the pillar. In the heat, starvation and drought. He impaled others, just stuck a stake straight through them, tied others to stakes. Anyone who rebelled, that's what he did. How terribly, awfully cruel. And in his pride, he healed up piles of the living and the dead from the captives, great heaps of human flesh. We've seen some terrible events in the Middle East under the so-called Islamic State in recent months. And perhaps, tragically, they are the successors to this evil. But they too, like the Assyrians, will meet their end. They will fall apart and implode and be destroyed. Because God is angry with such evil that causes so much distress. People burned alive in the fire. And we saw that with the Islamic State, with their Jordanian pilot. Pillaged, plundered, stripped. And the picture of how people reacted. In the end of the day, justice comes. God comes to put things right. God is angry when he sees his creation, you and me, suffering. And throughout the world there are evil empires. They've consistently used brutality against the people of God and indeed against others. They've robbed God's people. Sooner or later they will meet their day of justice. And they will lose everything of the accumulation of ill-gotten gains. And throughout the world today we see brutality in action, horrendous and tragic. 80% of all persecution in the world is directed against the followers of Jesus today. And followers of Jesus are being hounded, made to suffer, often losing their livelihoods, their homes and security. But such evil empires will inevitably fall and lose everything. It's as inevitable as night follows day. And we look at the Islamic empire, not Muslim people, the Islamic empires of the world, and what they're doing to the followers of Jesus, indeed the followers of any religion, but the followers of Jesus always suffer far worse. It fits the same pattern. And the prophetic word of Nahum is, such evil will eventually be brought down and destroyed. The followers of Jesus are having their homes taken from them, their security, their livelihood and businesses undermined totally and destroyed. They're kept in poverty, they're taxed extra, and they suffer brutality. Ultimate justice will come. Into chapter 3. The key failures of the Assyrians are listed. Did a lot of that, and they really victimized people. Deception was everywhere, and they were in it for what they could gain of material possessions. And again you see that today in countries of the Middle East, where non-Muslims, their homes are just taken from them, all their possessions are stripped from. When they flee, everything of value is taken from them and given to the Muslim overlords. They simply delighted in killing. The reliefs carved in stone show this vividly. There was a bloodlust, an endless cruelty about this people. They couldn't resist the people round about it, because the weapons the Assyrians had and their tactics were superior. People were victimized with utter brutality. And there was utter deception. The principle was to get things, so they stripped everything of value. Any person who had anything to offer that was of value to them, they deported them. They killed most of the rest, left the poor people in poverty. Deception was everywhere. They just stripped anything of value. Now you see a lot of that today in the world. God is angry. And in due time, because God's timing is perfect, He will intervene. And the evil empires that perpetrating these kind of things will fall. They will be defeated once for all. Nahum pictures the city of Nineveh. When we think of a city, we think of buildings. It's more accurate to think of people. But in the Bible, the city was seen as organized humanity. Remember, in the biblical era, most people were agriculturalists. They lived in villages. They lived on the fields. They farmed the land. But the city was organized. Even the biggest cities were tiny compared to our cities of today. Nineveh had about 120,000 inhabitants, probably the biggest city of its day, unusually large. If you think of the cities of the modern era with their millions, organized humanity, impersonal, often great suffering. The city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, described as Nahum. Our translations say city of blood, but in fact it's city of bloods, plural, stressing the way that this people group simply had a bloodlust and would kill for the fun of it. That was the way they worked. They wanted to conquer and rule others. And there are empires in the world today that are still doing the same, seeking continual expansion at the expense of others. But the outcomes that came for the Assyrian Empire were violence and brutality and material possessions. They accumulated the wealth of others, taken by brutality. And so many people suffered. What about today? In our Western culture, we might describe it as we're living for the now, for the material, for wealth, for money, and for what gives us pleasure. Possessions give us pleasure. And looking at our media and our publications, sex gives us pleasure. We're dominated by these two driving forces. But what it does is it generates a community that's wealth seeking, and our advertisements pander to that. But it leads to corruption, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, where people in powerful financial positions line their pockets and can bring an entire financial system of the world nearly to a collapse. We're socially divided, and there's an inbuilt selfishness. And you see that expressed in the growth of lotteries throughout the Western world. If you win, others lose. Islam proclaims itself as superior to all of this. But look at its countries and its cultures today. It's ruled by a rule book lifestyle. The rules are interpreted by the religious leaders, they're imposed by the political leaders. Everyone has to conform. There is uniformity. But they've lost creativity, the great gift that God has given to mankind. These lands are authoritarian. They're theocratic. But in practice they're run by a small cabal of religious leaders backed by political power. And it leads to violence. And you only have to look at the Islamic countries throughout the world today to see that pattern. And then we've got many countries in the world today that could be described as despotic cultures. Someone or a small group or a family wants unchallenged power, and they will take it, that power, and it doesn't matter who gets in the way. It leads to deception. It leads to a bending of the use of power in the legal systems. It leads to a ruling class, and it leads to majorities suffering. Perhaps these are all cities of bloods. And this way of trying to run life, organized humanity, all of that will go the same way as the Assyrian Empire in due time. Because God is angry, because the ordinary folk and their millions and billions suffer. That's not the purpose of God. He wants the best for his people, everywhere. The final onslaught is pictured by Nahum. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses, jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords, glittering spears, many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number. People are stumbling over the corpses. And indeed, history shows that exactly what Nahum predicted took place. That is an accurate picture of the fall of Nineveh. And Nahum gives the reason. All because of the wanton lust of a prostitute, that's the Assyrian Empire, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft. She tried to use her power to control others. And basically that's the underpinning thing of all witchcraft. But it goes further than that. Endless archaeological discoveries have shown the rampant level of witchcraft and sorcery that existed in this empire. It was endemic throughout the whole culture, and it tried to bring people down, using the power of evil spiritual forces to destroy others. For a long time, that was the picture of Assyria. And the people groups around about were terrified. If the Assyrians came, they knew what to expect. Nahum goes on in verse 7, all who see you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is in ruins. Who will mourn for her? Where can I find anyone to comfort you? Yes, Nineveh was left in ruins. Nobody lived there after the event. It just fell and disappeared. And it's only in archaeological digs much later that even the existence of the city come to light. Nobody wants to comfort this capital city of the Assyrian Empire. They're delighted that the empire has fallen, and at last they're free from this terrorizing fear. That was the widest extent of the empire. Nineveh was the capital. That's coming from the area where the Assyrian Empire actually started. And it slowly expanded and took things over, but had difficulty controlling it all. But that great king Ashurbanipal, his army moved south. He fancied just taking over Egypt. And Thebes, the great city of Egypt, fell to the Assyrians. Protected by water, full of valuable artifacts, temples, a big city, tens of thousands. It fell, and its population were treated to the same brutal cruelty that Ashurbanipal was. His reputation was for the ultimate of cruelty. And Thebes never really fully recovered from it. And what Nahum says to the people of Judah, because the army had passed by the land of Judah on the way to Egypt. Nahum says, do you remember what they did to Thebes? The same will be done to Nineveh. That's what Ashurbanipal claimed. This city, the whole of it, that's Thebes, I conquered it with the help of Ashur and Ishtar, that's his gods. Silver, gold, and precious stones, all the wealth of the palace, rich cloth, precious linen, great horses, supervising men and women, 2 obelisks of splendid electrum. I think they were made of copper, weighing 2,500 talents, worth a fortune. The doors of the temples I tore from their bases and carried them off to Assyria. With this weighty booty I left Thebes. Against Egypt and Cush I have lifted my spear and shown my power. With full hands I have returned to Nineveh in good health. What arrogance! What pride! This warrior king, successful army leader, characterized with the ultimate of brutality and evil, just accumulating wealth. He couldn't take it when he died, 627 BC. And his empire was ripe for collapse, imploding upon itself, and was beaten down by a combination of other empires led by the Babylonians. And by 612, Nineveh had gone. And that's what Nahum says. And history shows that Nahum understood the purposes of God exactly right, writing in a period where Judah was threatened by this powerful empire. It's going to go. It's going to be defeated. It'll fall in the same way. The way they treated others, they will be treated. And nothing they've got will stand against it. Their defenses will not be good enough. Their leadership will fail. Their disciplined army is of no use. All their hard work, the sheer numbers in their army, the resources and wealth that they possess, their magnificent organization skills, their power in economics, none of that will be sufficient to stop the collapse of this empire. And the prophetic book of Nahum finishes with an epitaph over Assyria. King of Assyria, your shepherds, that's your leaders, slumber. Your nobles lie down to rest. They're dead. Your people are scattered on the mountains. They were. No one to gather them. Their leadership collapsed. Within a few years, the whole empire didn't even exist. Nothing can heal you, and history shows nothing did. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall. Just a relief that this brutality was over. For who has not felt your endless cruelty? What an epitaph! There's the empire. We saw in the first presentation the wonderful achievements of this culture. It had so much to offer the world. It introduced so much that was good. But it chose that direction. Started with Tiglath-Pileser I, about 1000 BC. The way of selfish expansion, the way of violence, extreme cruelty, destroying lives and people groups just for the fun of it. Jonah brought them warnings, the reluctant prophet. They listened for a while, they put their house in order for a while, but then they returned to their old ways. And their violence, in due course, many decades later, the violence and the cruelty reached a peak under Ashurbanipal. They signed their death warrant. You can't thumb your nose at God forever. God's agenda is the best for humanity, and he gets angry when he sees the ordinary human beings of life, the yous and the me's, suffering because of this. God intervened. He intervened to put things right. It comes as night follows day, and no one mourned the passing of this empire, because it become so evil, so corrupted. You see, Nahum grasped what God was about to do. Even though the situation in his day was filled with no sign of hope, he grasped what God was about to do, and he brought hope to the people of Judah, the people of God, who were beleaguered. They didn't respond to that hope tragically, and the people of God fell to the Babylonians in due time. But that's what prophecy is all about, grasping the mind of God in a specific situation. In this series we've looked at two prophets, the prophets of Assyria, the prophets who spoke to or about the great empire of Assyria. Jonah warned the people of Nineveh, the capital city, what would happen if they didn't put their house in order. The reluctant prophet. They didn't put their house in order permanently. And Nahum came, and he was preparing the people of Judah, the people of God, giving them hope that the empire was going to collapse and Nineveh would be wiped out. There's a deeper message for all of us today. There are empires. Some are political, some are commercial, some are religious, and some have got combinations in varying degrees of all three, often supported by media and their empires. And the call of Jonah today is to put our house in order. Too much suffering is being caused by the greed and selfishness of the leaders of empires today. But perhaps God is preparing us, the people of God, particularly those who in far distant lands are suffering in the most horrendous ways, the persecution imposed upon them by political or religious regimes, and whose lives are being made absolutely misery, and indeed in many cases who are being killed simply because they follow Jesus. The empires of the world that continue to thumb their nose at God's purpose for humankind, these empires will sooner or later be wiped out and collapse, never to be resuscitated. That is the purpose of God, and that is something of the message of the prophets of Assyria.